Bandsaw week, and I have for you an amazing super safety tip. Look what it says. It says, always remember on the bandsaw to maintain a 2-inch margin of safety. Never allow your fingers directly on the cut line. And then at all times, make sure you never stand to the right of the machine. And we're going to see that when we get over there in a couple minutes with Colin. One of the new students, he'll be standing directly on the right side. I don't know what to do about these guys. That 2-inch margin of safety, it may seem like a small amount, but because the blade is in a stationary position, we can be real careful about making these intricate cuts without getting our finger too close to the blade. But that 2-inch margin of safety is kind of standard on the bandsaw. The other thing, never allow your finger directly on the line. Think about it. If you're cutting a heart shape out, and that's what we're going to do today, if my fingers are never on that cut line, I don't have any reason to fear. And then the last, standing on the right side, the blade goes in from the right. If it can go in from the right, it naturally can come out from the right. And so we always want to avoid that. On the other side of the board, I think you can see it. I'll move down. There are 7 key terms, and of those 7 key terms, I think 6 or 7 of them find themselves on the test. Padsawing on the test, you're going to get a chance to read about that in the chapter 24. That's in your Google Classroom. Not only that, there's questions in the chapter 24. There's 7 questions at the end of it. That's not 7. 7, 6, 7. There's 7 questions at the end of the chapter that you'll be responsible for. That's one of the answers to one of them. Same thing with the next one. Resawing, it's on the test. It's in those 7 questions. It's in that chapter 24 worksheet. Blade guides, important. Thrust bearing, important. You'll read about those in the chapter. Upper, lower, and rear blade guards, wheel guard. Really important. One of the questions asks on the table, on the bandsaw test, true or false, the lower wheel does not require a guard. That's not true. Relief cuts important. We'll talk about those. And outside irregular cuts is the type of cut that the bandsaw is amazing at making. And I'll get into that in a little more detail. Hey, I'll meet you over there at the bandsaw. Make sure you bring your safety glasses. All right, guys, thanks for joining me. I'm glad you guys showed up. You don't have safety glasses on, but I'm glad you decided to wear your masks. Some of you anyways. I just wish you wouldn't have used my mask. That's not real sanitary. Come on, man. So Colin, a few minutes ago, I just mentioned to them that the super safety tip says you can't stand on the right side of the machine. The blade goes in there. You can't be there. We got to move you back, Jack. All right, Colin, you're good now. Be careful back there, Tina. Colin, Tina, and Steve. Steve, it's all right to be short. You don't have to stand up on a chair. Please cover your nose up. Okay. This is the bandsaw, and I think you can probably see the whole thing if I tip it down just a little bit. Talking about the parts, this part at the top is the upper a wheel guard. There is a wheel at the top and also a wheel at the bottom, and both wheels require a door that covers them. Think about it. If the wheel guard wasn't there, the upper and lower, you would literally just have this spinning wheel with a blade attached to it. The reason the bandsaw gets its name for bandsaw is because the blade is literally one long band. If we cut it in one spot and stretched it out, it'd be the longest blade in the shop. It'd be over 11 feet long. It's an amazing machine. The blade's real narrow and small, but it still has an ability to make some awesome cuts. And the cuts that it makes are outside irregular cuts. You say, what in the world is that? An outside irregular cut, if you think about it in terms of a heart, if I had a board like this and I wanted to cut it, this is a beautiful piece of wood that grew naturally in the wild. It grew walnut on one side and cherry on the other. Nah, that's not true. We glued it together. But if you had a piece of wood like this and you wanted to make a heart, you could do it 2 ways. You could have the heart be on the inside of the board, so you have a square board with a heart in the middle, or you could take the board and turn the whole board into a heart. The bandsaw cannot do the inside irregular cut. That machine would be the scroll saw. Normally, I'd like to teach you that this week. I'm not going to do it. We're just going to do the bandsaw. The bandsaw cannot do an inside irregular cut. It can only do an outside irregular cut. So I can take this board I can draw a heart-shaped cut on it, and I can make that cut on the bandsaw. So that's what the bandsaw does. Outside irregular shape cuts. A couple more parts before we move on. Obviously, this is the blade. The blade, like I mentioned, is 11 feet long. Like the table saw, there's a table insert. These are parts of your test, so I'm trying to go over them. This is obviously the table. The bandsaw comes equipped with a miter gauge slot. If you wanted to make a crosscut, you could put a miter gauge in here, set your board on the table with the miter gauge, and then make a crosscut. The bandsaw could also make a rip. You could set up a fence, and lots of people sell fences for bandsaws. We make ours. And if you wanted to, you could set up a fence on the bandsaw and you could make a rip. But one of the questions on the test asks, hey, is it true or false that a rip, it can be straighter on the table saw than on the bandsaw? And it's not true. The bandsaw's blade is very narrow and it has what's called walk or wander. And so although you think the blade is cutting perfectly straight, it sometimes wavers or wanders just a little bit left and right. And so yes, it can be made. You can make a rip, you can make a crosscut on the bandsaw, but it may not be as accurate as a table saw. But another question on the test is true or false. It is safer to cut a really warped board on the bandsaw. Think about it, if you had a board like this and you tried to cut that joker on the table saw, what would want to happen is it want to kick it back because it doesn't have great points of contact. But because of the way the bandsaw operates with no kickback, because the blade spins over and comes down and through the table, so kickback would literally go down into the table. There's no kickback on the bandsaw, so it is safer to cut a board that's really warped like that on the table saw. Let's say I need to just break it in half so I could flat joint it. Do it on the bandsaw, flat joint it, and then once it's flat, then we could cut it safer on the table saw. So just a couple of points of note for you. Look, I also should mention this. This is the bandsaw study guide. I linked it plus the other bandsaw study guide, the one with all the names of the blades, the names of the internal parts, and the names of the external parts. I linked all that into your Google Classroom so you can study for the bandsaw. Okay, I'm gonna pause and get set up. I'll be right back. All right, guys, I'm back. Just like the table saw, there is a proper setup for the blade height on the bandsaw, and it is just the same as the table saw. I should have the blade guide assembly about 1/8 to 1/4 above the material. Now, that's the same kind of general principle as the table saw. The less blade we have exposed, the safer it is. It also, because of the flexibility of the bandsaw blade, it also gives me greater stability. It kind of helps to hold it. The other thing I wanted to mention that I neglected a few minutes ago is the size of the bandsaw is determined by the diameter of the wheels. The diameter of the wheels on the bandsaw determines the size. This one happens to be a 14-inch because there are 14-inch diameter wheels on the top and then on the bottom of the machine. Okay, so I have this beautiful board that I mentioned a few minutes ago, and then I have that heart drawn on there. Any bandsaw cut that I want to make, I have to consider my cut plan. And then when you look at this, I have a couple of things that I have to do. I have to make that little straight cut first. I have to make a few other relief cuts, and you remember that from just a few minutes ago when we were talking about the key terms. A relief cut is a very important cut. And the reason is the bandsaw does not work like people think. They think, you know what, let me just go ahead and get on the bandsaw and just make the heart. It can't do that. The blade can't bend and be manipulated to make some of these tight cuts. But what it can be used to do is to make a bunch of straight cuts and make those straight cuts turn into these different type of shaped cuts, outside irregular cuts. And so let me turn it on, and then I'll kind of be over here. Steve, be careful, don't fall off the chair. Colin, you can see good there. Tina, you'll be able to see back there. I'm going to make the relief cuts, and I'll kind of talk you through it. That's why I have these awesome headphones on, so I can talk as I'm making the cuts. I think I'll be all right. You could see from there. It'd be sweet if I could give you a real close-up, though. Let me pause and see if I can get a little closer. All right, so technically you guys are in the the area of the bandsaw. You shouldn't be on the right side of the machine, but that's all right. I think you should be all right. I'll be able to protect you. All right, let's fire this thing up and see what she does. To turn the machine on, there's a green button on the left-hand side. You can see my finger. You got to press in it kind of hard. There is no dust collector for the bandsaw. It doesn't make enough sawdust. Look, 2-inch margin of safety. Keep my fingers to the side. Never directly on the line that I'm going to cut. Relief cut. I can make as many relief cuts as I want. I don't have to be limited to the few that I drew on there. I can make as many as I want. I made a bunch. Now look, I'm going to go ahead and trim this left side. I can do it with one hand. I can do it from the other side with one hand. Whatever I feel most comfortable doing. And the goal is to not bind or bend or twist the blade. To simply allow the blade to make the cuts that it can. The relief cuts, once I meet my relief cut, as you can see, I'm able to adjust the angle and then start again. That way I don't have to bind or bend or twist the blade. Those little tiny cutoffs in there, we would not reach in our fingers to get them. We could just use our board and push them out. There's a box that lives right behind. Colin, can you pick that up? Thank you. Colin, put your mask up. Look, 2-inch margin of safety. Fingers never on the cut line. Bunch of relief cuts. The more you make, the easier it is. Let's cut the inside of this heart now. Don't bend it. Don't bind it. Let it cut a straight cut. If you have to, make more relief cuts. Let it adjust itself. The goal of any good bandsaw cut is to leave the pencil mark that you started with. If you leave the pencil mark, it becomes so much easier in the sanding process, which I'm going to set up and show you next. The sanding becomes much, much, much easier when you leave the pencil marks because, to shut it off, just press the red button, because it gives you something to look at to sand back to. And I always start with a heart. There I am. I'm going to tip it up now. I always make a heart on the bandsaw first because it gives me both you're falling. It gives me both an inside cut and an outside cut, so I can show you both. But the key to any cut, like I mentioned a little bit ago, is those relief cuts. I'm going to pause you, set up the sander, show you the sander. I'll be right back. All right, Colin, this is how you do it. There's nobody behind Colin, just so you know. That's Colin running the machine by himself. Just joking. It's me. Hey, so this machine that we're fortunate, Colin, you got to move out of the way now, kiddo. This machine that we have that you see here is called the disc sander. And what it has on it is a 60 grit sandpaper that spins very rapidly. There is a correct side to sand on and an incorrect side to sand on. Think about it. If it's spinning this way, it's going down into the table here, not on the red side. If I go on the opposite side, the side of red, it's going to want to grab the board and throw it up towards the ceiling. So every time I sand, it has to be on the left-hand side, the non-red side. It's super easy. Keep your fingers away from it. Otherwise, you'll be getting a manicure. You don't want to get a manicure. It cannot sand the face of your board. No, it cannot. It cannot sand the ends of your board. It will burn them. But it can, however, sand these outside irregular cuts that you've made on the bandsaw. It works really good with the bandsaw. They work together, like me and peanut butter sandwiches. Peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And so what I'm left with is a perfectly shaped heart that's half walnut and half cherry. I did it backwards. Half cherry, half walnut. When you go to shut it off, the machine takes a little while to stop because it's like a big flywheel. And so there's an eraser that lives right by it. You can just sand it to erase it. All right, I wanted to show you the heart first. It's the very start of my demo, but the next is super important for your curio wall shelves, which we're going to get to in a little bit, but I wanted to teach you now. All right, I'll pause and be back. All right, guys, so the reason I wanted to teach you the bandsaw now was because at some point, God willing, we're going to be back here, and I want to do the curio wall shelf with you. And one of the best parts about the curio wall shelf are these arches at the top. And because it's an outside irregular cut, the bandsaw is the machine that can make that cut. And so I have a pair of sample arches here. And then I also have a blank piece of wood here that we're going to make our arches on. And in order to get an accurate arch, we have what's known as a jig. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause it in a minute, but when I pause it, I'm going to pause it and set the jig up on the edge, line it up along the bottom, and then I'll trace it, flip it over, and do the same thing on the other side. Colin, what are you doing on the machine? You guys got to come back. These guys are driving me nuts. They won't wear their safety glasses. They're standing up on the machines. I got to talk to them about their masks. Colin, come on now. You cannot be standing up on the machine. My mask, they're wearing my masks, guys. All right, come on back. These guys are driving me nuts. I'll pause and then I'll set up. Okay, so I'm back and I have the arches drawn out. And then not only do I have the arches drawn out, but I also made a lot of relief cuts. And I always tell people running the bandsaw is kind of intuitive, and that means it comes from inside of your brain. Some people are great at it, and other people aren't good at it, and that's all right. You have to know what you're good at and what you need a little work at. If you feel like you're going to be great at bandsawing, it's going to be because you are comfortable with making a bunch of relief cuts. If you try to go at it with like 2 or 3 relief cuts, it's going to be tough on you. The more relief cuts, the easier the cut, because you can move your blade every little couple few inches or half inches or whatever it is. I'm going to move the camera again so you can get a better view, and then we'll make this cut. All right, guys, just like last time, I'm setting the blade height up 1/8 to 1/4 above, just like the table saw. I'm going to maintain that 2-inch margin of safety at all times, and then I'm also going to make sure my fingers are never directly on the line. Relief cut, real nice and easy along those marks that I've made. The goal, again, is to avoid cutting outside the line. I want to, when I'm all done, I want to still have that pencil mark that I made, that arch mark that I made. I want to still have that. That's really important to me. So when I sand it, it becomes a lot easier. You can see the relief cuts. I did not follow the marks the whole way, and that's all right. It doesn't matter where they go. That's all scrap wood anyways. I'm going to start into my cut. The hardest part is finding the start. If I'm at a bad angle and I'm like way too far in, I could just adjust and change it and make it so it's easier to go. If I'm too far off of the line, I can take more. What I don't want to do is get too close to the line where I end up cutting the line. So what I do is go a little bit, adjust. Go a little more, adjust. A little more, adjust. Every time I hit a relief cut, I'm adjusting again. You can see this hand in the back. It is constantly adjusting. And then as I cut, I'm evaluating and deciding, all right, the next thing I have to do is turn it this way, turn it that way. And then when it's all said and done, those little pieces, again, don't reach your finger in there to get them. Use your board to kick them out, or shut the machine off and wait for it to stop to get them. But don't reach your fingers in to get them. That would be uncool. And there it is. You can see I kept my pencil mark all the way around. Really important. All right, guys, I'm going to pause it and then set up the next sander I want to show you. Tina, we are in the middle of a demonstration. What are you doing? Get in here. Come on. What is going on? This is far more important than what's going on out there. I know the bell rang, but that don't matter. You should really have your mask on. Colin, come over here where you can see better. Okay, guys, so this machine is called a Boss sander, benchtop oscillating spindle sander. When it spins, it makes a rotating and also an oscillating. So it spins and it oscillates, so you can utilize the majority of your sandpaper. There's an on-off switch on it. It turns it on, and you can see it oscillates. Again, just like with the disc sander, you don't want to get your fingers anywhere near it. You want to touch real lightly up against it and sand back to that pencil mark that you made. Now, if you don't keep your pencil mark, this is where the problems arise, because you won't know what to sand back to. You'll just be free forming it. You'll be going by free hand. But by having the pencil mark, I can see what I'm working back to. Colin, you see that? It's important. Tina, stay there. Don't be trying to leave. I'm watching you. This piece of wood is pine, so it's kind of really easy to sand, and just like that, I sand it all the way back to my pencil mark. If I want to make some differences and some changes, I'm allowed to do that, but that's the bare minimum cut for the arches on the curio wall shelf. Let me go over my form real quick, do some quick test review with you, so when you take the test, you'll do great. I mentioned the size of the bandsaw is the diameter of the wheels. Hey, when the bandsaw is properly tensioned, I had to unplug it because one of the test questions says, in order to make adjustments on the bandsaw blade should be stopped, completely stopped, and also unplugged when I'm messing with the blade. And when it's properly tensioned, the bandsaw blade should have very little wiggle, almost like 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch. It should move only a little bit. If it has a lot of movement, it's going to fall off of the wheels. If it has no movement at all, it'll be too tight. There's a weld that connects those two edges, and if that weld is stretched way hard, then it has a tendency to break, and we don't want that to happen. So it should flex about 1/8 to 1/4. I mentioned cutting warp stock is safer on the bandsaw because the table saw has kickback and the bandsaw doesn't. Oh, after installing a new blade on the bandsaw, you can't see me. Oh, there I am. After installing a new blade on the bandsaw, when you read it in the chapter, you'll see it, but it says, in order to see if it's tracking properly, and that means, is it rolling on the wheel exactly where it should be? And I think you can see it. The blade stays directly in the center. In order to check if it stays in the center or tracks properly, don't just fire that thing up, spin it by hand, watch it. It's tracking perfectly. Once I know it's tracking perfect, I can close the upper and the lower wheel guard. In order to put the new blade on, this lower wheel actually drops down. I spin this wheel and that drops down, and that allows me to put the blade on and off. Let me see what else I have. Bandsaw blades are used primarily to make irregular cuts. I talked about that. Hey, study those parts. Those parts are probably one of the more difficult elements of the test. Please, nobody miss the on-off switch. It literally says on-off on it. Also, you have to know one of the tooth styles and one of the set styles. Tooth styles, set styles. You just have to know one of them. Fill in the blank. One tooth style, one set style. You should avoid backing out of cuts. Now, naturally, you have to back out of relief cuts, but out of a long spiral cut that you made, you can't do it. The blade's going to get bound and pulled off track. There's also these parts inside of the bandsaw that you'll be able to see in the back of your packet. And although you don't have to label them, you have to know about them. And we talked about the blade guard, but I want to mention the thrust bearing. The thrust bearing is what prevents the blade from being pushed off of the back of the wheel. When I put pressure on that blade by making a cut, if there's no thrust bearing, I could literally push the blade directly off of the wheel. That wouldn't be a good thing. If the blade breaks when you're cutting, and it sometimes happens, what happens is that pressure in that weld at some point gives up. And what a natural thing that happens before it is there's a rhythmic clicking, click, 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 click. That's because that seam or that weld is starting to break. I have sawdust in my hair, and you didn't even tell me, Steve. Oh man. That weld starts to break, and so it makes this rhythmic clicking, click, 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 click. And then if it does break, what will happen is those wheels will keep spinning, the blade will go up inside, it'll make a noise. If it happens, just shut it off, and just let me know, and then I'll come over and fix it. You do not want to open this up because that blade will be spinning inside of it. I did the thrust bearing. There's also these things called guide blocks. And what they do is they're around the blade. They're directly around the blade, and they keep it from twisting. So if you're putting a lot of pressure on it, you're going to hear them start to scream because the blade's going to rub up against those guide blocks, and it's going to start to make a I hurt myself. It starts to make a loud noise, and that lets you know, hey, you're putting too much pressure on that. Um, I told you where to stand. I told you need a tooth style and a set style. I told you about the size of the bandsaw. And then when adjusting the bandsaw, the upper wheel moves. Okay, guys, I'm going to be under 30 minutes. I hope that it was a good demo for you and that you learned a lot. But you're still going to have to read the chapter, review the chapter. You're still going to have to do those 7 questions at the back of the chapter and then the chapter 24 worksheet. And then it would be a great idea for you to look over the bandsaw study guide. I've put a lot of these questions I just talked about. And then also you want to look over this study guide. Please, if you have any questions, hit me up. We're doing another test next week. And so if this doesn't work for you, you have to let me know early so I can make adjustments to next week's drill press. Steve, you're the only one that didn't cause trouble today. Nice job. I'm giving you a bonus point, Steve.